Well, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here with you today and share a little bit more about my research, as you can see, entitled Looking Beyond the Temples, the People of Angkor. However, before I begin, I always like to have my thanks and acknowledgments to the many individuals and institutions that have supported this work. Archaeology is deeply collaborative, and none of the research that I'm presenting here today could have been done by myself. It's very much a team project, and so I really want to make sure that I start out by acknowledging especially our partners in Cambodia, the Apsara National Authority, and the Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts, and the other institutions, organizations, and individuals that have been a part of our project and supported this work. So, an outline for my talk today will start by orienting where and when we are, a really brief background. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we know about Angkor so far and kind of giving a history of research to contextualize a little bit of what I'll be telling you about later, of the part of the research that I've been doing. And then I'll be talking more specifically about the people of Angkor in 2 locations. And so I've been part of archaeological projects that have looked at the residential spaces of people living right in downtown Angkor next to the temple of Angkor Wat, as well as people who live in the provinces. And so I'll be sharing a bit of that information with you as well, and then we'll wrap up with some conclusions. So to start about where and when we are, we're in mainland Southeast Asia, and as you can see on this map here, the yellow blob is showing you the extent of the Angkor Empire at its height. And what you can see is that this was a massive empire that covered almost all of mainland Southeast Asia, although its heartland is in what is now the modern-day nation of Cambodia, and the capital was this location on the map here that you can see we call Greater Angkor. I'll be zooming into that in just a second. It's also sometimes referred to as the Khmer Empire, after the majority ethno-linguistic group in Cambodia. It lasted from about the 9th to 15th centuries AD or CE, and this was a Hindu-Buddhist kingdom. So you're probably familiar with Angkor because of its amazing stone temples, especially the Temple of Angkor Wat. And these were built by kings, rulers, elites, in honor of either Hindu gods or the Buddha. And in fact, Hinduism and Buddhism were practiced at the same time. They were not mutually exclusive in Cambodia, and so you can see a lot of different Hindu gods and the Buddha represented in these different temples. And in fact, the temple of Angkor Wat itself started out as a temple dedicated to the god Vishnu, and then later became transformed into a Buddhist temple. And so these were the kind of major focus of the ideology and the ritual of the elites and the people in Angkor. Okay, so what do we know about Angkor and how do we know it? If you have been through the Angkor exhibit, you probably saw that there, at the very beginning, there is an idea about the old view of Angkor. And the old view is that Angkor was discovered by the French, and specifically by this explorer named Henri Mouhot in 1860. I have discovery in quotes, or discovered in quotes here, because Angkor was never forgotten about, so it didn't really need to be discovered. It was well known in Cambodia, it was well known across Asia, as I'll be telling you about a little bit more in a second. And in fact, Henri Mouhot wasn't the first European to have visited Angkor Wat, but he was exceptionally wonderful illustrator, and he was very vivid in his descriptions. And so he was really the first person to popularize Angkor in France and the West, and has over time kind of been mistakenly attributed as the discoverer when that is not the case. But he did, in fact, bring Angkor to a wider audience, so we can give him credit for that. But as I mentioned, Angkor was not completely forgotten by Cambodians and was well known across Asia. So what you're seeing on the slide here is actually a map of Angkor Wat, a plan of the temple of Angkor Wat, that was believed to have been drawn initially in the early 17th century and then copied, so this is a copy that was made in 1715, from a Japanese visitor who came to Angkor and to Angkor Wat as part of a Buddhist pilgrimage. And so Angkor was known across Asia and was this important site. If you go to Angkor Wat today, you can see graffiti on the walls from many different people who visited the temple over the years. So it wasn't forgotten about in Asia, and then of course it wasn't forgotten about in Cambodia as well. Part of the bas-reliefs around the temple of Angkor Wat were actually unfinished at the time the temple was constructed, but one of the post-Angkorian kings, King Angchan, sponsored the completion of those bas-reliefs in 1564, which is just a little bit over 100 years after the supposed collapse and destruction of Angkor, although we now don't think that was exactly how Angkor ended. We do know that Angkor was depopulated and that the royal court and much of the population left Angkor and moved to the area close to what is now the capital of Phnom Penh, further south. But there was still a small population that stayed in the region. And of course, many people kept returning to this area over and over again. So it definitely wasn't forgotten by Cambodian people. Nevertheless, when the French arrived, they did start systematically studying and inventorying the different Angkorian temples that were located across the country, and they were really formalizing the study of Angkor from a Western perspective. They did a lot of work reconstructing temples, building an art historical and architectural chronology, and they also inventoried and translated the many different Khmer and Sanskrit inscriptions that we find on the temples themselves or on freestanding stela next to the temples. And so with this massive amount of work that they did, they were able to construct a history of Angkor. And so from their work, we are able to understand who ruled Angkor, when they ruled, the different kind of temples they built, different historical events that took place over time. And this was a major contribution to our understanding of Angkor, formalized in this kind of Western historical perspective. And it is really a foundation on which a lot of the other work has been done since then. What you can see here is an example of like some of the work that they would have done is inventorying and identifying the different art historical styles, the events that are getting depicted in some of the bas-reliefs on the temples. So this is believed to be King Suryavarman II, architect, or not the architect, but the king who sponsored the construction of the Temple of Angkor Wat. So this was really important work, but of course it focused primarily on royalty, elites, the upper echelons of society. As you're also likely aware, Cambodia underwent really serious socio-political turmoil in the mid-20th century and the second half of the 20th century. After achieving independence from France in 1953, Cambodia just had a few years of peaceful independence before kind of getting sucked into the regional conflict and undergoing internal conflict and civil war in the late 1960s. The Khmer Rouge invaded Phnom Penh in April 1975, and they ruled Cambodia until Vietnamese forces recaptured the capital of Phnom Penh in January 1979. And then they remained in Cambodia until 1989. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1991, and the first democratic elections were held in 1993. So it really isn't until the mid-1990s that archaeological research began again in Cambodia. And essentially what it means is that, much like all of life and society in Cambodia, archaeology essentially was put on hold for about 25, 30 years during this period. And it also means that compared to other parts of the world that didn't undergo these kinds of conflict, the knowledge about Angkor is about, you would imagine, it would be about 30 years behind. More importantly, however, is the massive loss of knowledge because of the Khmer Rouge period. Only 3 Cambodian archaeologists in Cambodia survived the Khmer Rouge period. One of them is this man, His Excellency Chuch Puan, and he recognized immediately that they needed to put in a lot of effort to rebuild the next generation of Cambodian archaeologists and rebuild and continue the knowledge about Angkor and Cambodian history and prehistory. So on his invitation, he partnered with my colleague, Dr. Miriam Stark at the University of Hawaii, and together they began a research and training program to start training the next generation of Cambodian archaeologists with the Royal University of Fine Arts in Phnom Penh. You can see a picture here of one of the early groups of students that were part of some of their research and training. I was really lucky to get to join Miriam in the field in 2005 and participate in her research and the training and collaboration process that she was working on with her project. What's really wonderful is that because of the efforts of Cambodian archaeologists like Chuch Puan and partnering with international and foreign archaeologists like Miriam Stark and others,
there has been a really successful archaeology program built in Cambodia, and many of the people who worked with Miriam as students are now in the Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts, in the Apsara National Authority, and also some of them have gone on to pursue PhDs and additional studies abroad, and they are now the ones teaching the next generation of Cambodian archaeologists. So I think this is one of the great successes that's taken place, and I think we can say that now, as an international researcher in Cambodia, we're able to really truly collaborate with our Cambodian colleagues and archaeologists and have them fully participate in our projects, not just as students, although we do still have training of students, but also as our collaborators. Okay, so thinking about how this affected our knowledge of Angkor, this is a map of Angkor and the landscape surrounding it that was published by a French archaeologist named B.P. Grolier in 1979. And it was based on his work that he had done in the country until he was forced to leave in the 1970s, and kind of represented what we knew about Angkor and its landscape for about 25 or 30 years. This was it. It was based on the last research that had been done before the Khmer Rouge period. And you can see, we're able to see that there's the primary downtown Angkor where all the temples are and what you visit as a tourist if you go to Angkor today. And then you can see the surrounding landscape around it, and especially many of the infrastructure networks, the water networks, road networks, a little bit of the countryside. But it is a bit of a limited view. One benefit, I suppose, of the pause in research that took place is that when research restarted and began again, we're able to take advantage of a lot of the technological developments that had taken place. And so several of my colleagues took advantage of a lot of remote sensing data, for example, as well as on-the-ground survey. And in 2007, they published this map of Angkor. And you can see now we have a much more expansive understanding of this landscape. And then we've also undertaken LiDAR surveys, and now we've been able to fill in this map even further and really understand the extent of the settlement of Angkor. So this map is showing this 3,000 square kilometer area of what you can see is a kind of denser downtown monumental zone, and then surrounded by this a little bit less dense agricultural landscape where you have lots of small house mounds and temples integrated together through this road and water management network. And so this map of Angkor has really shifted our understanding of the scale of this landscape and the kind of immensity of this city. I have been lucky enough to be working as part of a collaborative project led by my colleague Sarah Clausen. And together, let's see if that animation will go. Okay. Together with several of our other colleagues, we have been able to, or we've published an estimate of the population of Angkor and a model of how we think the city grew over time. So what this animation is showing you is how we estimate the city was growing over time between these different periods. And what you can see is that in the beginning there were a few different kind of population hotspots in the landscape, and then over time you start seeing this metropolitan area, this kind of more agricultural area surrounding the downtown city center fill in over time. The other chart on here is showing the population in different parts of the landscape. So the dark red bit on the bottom is what we think was the downtown civic ceremonial center monument zone of Angkor, which had a fairly consistent population over time. And then the pink version here, the pink part of the graph, lighter color, is showing the population in this metropolitan kind of agricultural area surrounding the downtown part of the city. And what you can really see is that the population jumps over time. So as Angkor grew as a city, it wasn't necessarily that the downtown areas were growing, it was that this landscape surrounding it was really getting filled in over time. And we start seeing this jump, this dramatic jump in the late 9th to 10th centuries. What the model has ended on is what we think was the period with the greatest population, and we're estimating between 700 and 900,000 people on this landscape. So this would have been probably the largest city in the world at that time in the late 12th and 13th centuries. You can see there was a big jump in population in the downtown area, but again, it's really the agricultural zones around the city where we also have a really large population of people. So This is very exciting to me as an archaeologist and to a lot of us because, as I mentioned earlier, the history of research of Angkor has focused primarily on that downtown zone and primarily on the activities of elites, like constructing temples, inscriptions, like really beautiful and scenic parts of Angkor. But what we're learning is that Angkor was this massive city with a huge population. And so myself and many other people have, of course, wondered, where are people living at Angkor? How can we understand their daily lives? How can we come to understand the non-elite members of the Angkorian civilization? And so that's really been a question that's driven a lot of the work that I've been a part of. We do know a little bit about some of these people from a few different sources. So one very famous source is a Chinese visitor to Angkor named Jodak Guan, who came in 1296 CE, and he wrote this book called Record of Cambodia, A Land and Its People. It's been translated into English. It's a short and very entertaining read, so I would encourage any of you, if you see it in a bookshop or at your library, to check it out. He came to Cambodia and lived there for almost a year and just kind of observed life in the capital and wrote about it, and it's an amazing resource for archaeologists. And one of the things he talked about were just the people who were living in Angkor, and he observed that poor people lived in small houses with thatch roofs, like you can see here. What I'll also point out, as you can see, is that houses in Cambodia, like elsewhere in Southeast Asia even today, are built up on posts or piles. And so what you have when you have an Angkorian house is the living space on the upper floor, which is primarily like a private space used mostly for sleeping. And then you have a lower space underneath the house. And some people might use that to keep animals. Sometimes it's a kind of a place for storage. It can be a place, kind of like a cool, shaded place to hang out during the day, kind of like a more public living space. And then oftentimes people might have a small kitchen kind of set off to near or next to or close to the house. It's a little bit farther away from the actual house structure itself. And so he observed that people would have these houses and they would have smaller houses with thatch roofs, but that wealthier people had larger houses and they would have ceramic roof tiles. So kind of like this example here. This would be a house that would be much more visible in the archaeological record. As you can imagine, houses made out of organic materials don't preserve well in the hot and humid climate in Southeast Asia. But finding a house with like really large post holes or ceramic roof tiles, that can give us an idea about if we had a wealthier person living somewhere. Cambodian people also, or the elites at least, depicted some of the daily life of Angkor on their temples, and especially on the Temple of the Bayon, which is located right in the heart of downtown Angkor, in the center of a neighborhood called Angkor Thom. And there's plenty of scenes of daily life, and if you go through the exhibit, there's a great portion of the exhibit that has many of these other scenes from daily life depicted. And what we can see here is like people doing all sorts of everyday things, being in a market, cooking food. Jodak Guan also commented on the kinds of plants and animals he saw, the kind of food that people ate. He did observe that poor people would primarily have small earthenware pots that they would cook on hearths that would be like 3 stones set in the ground. So you can kind of see an example of a little hearth with a little pot and someone cooking rice on it, and then a larger kind of cauldron where they're cooking animals and cooking meat. And then you can also see people kind of grilling. There's like animals or probably fish probably on some bamboo skewers that might be grilled. So he observed these kinds of activities. And much like the houses, he also observed that wealthier people would often have higher quality materials, like metal objects that they might use for cooking and eating as well. So these kinds, the historic and these kind of artistic depictions can give us a little bit of an idea about daily life for people. The Angkorian non-elite people did not write about themselves. The inscriptions that we find were written by and for elites. But many of these inscriptions would describe donations to temples and kind of the economic activity of temples. And as part of that, they would discuss like some of the people who worked in the temples. So this is a stela from the Temple of Ta Prohm, which in Angkorian period was known as Rajvihara University. And this was built in the late 12th century CE. And as part of this inscription, they talk about this place as a temple, but also a place of learning, and that there would be 1,409 students and teachers living on site together in this temple and temple enclosure. And so this is actually an inscription that inspired some of our work and a reason why we started looking for habitation around the temples, because this inscription does talk about how these temples weren't just empty landscapes like you see them today when you go visit as a tourist, but they were filled with people, and they seem to have been filled with people who were living right next to them. These inscriptions also list some other occupations that non-elite people might have had in the temples, and so there's people who were umbrellas holders, religious specialists, musicians, dancers, cooks, singers, just kind of laborers and guards. So we know that there were a lot of non-elite people that helped keep the temples running and worked with the temples as well too. But like I said, they didn't write about themselves, and we have just these few sources of information telling us about what their lives were like. But if we really want to understand more fully what their lives were like, the best option for us, or the best line of research, is to do archaeological excavation, and especially to excavate the places where people are living. In Angkor, we do not find burials for a variety of reasons. So we don't have burials or grave goods to tell us about people, but we can look at where they're living and essentially look at their garbage that they left behind for us and try to use that to help reconstruct more about what their daily lives were like. And so that has been the goal of a lot of our work. Of course, this is challenging because a lot of Angkor is quite forested. The houses themselves have completely disintegrated, so we don't have any remains of actual Angkorian houses left. But what we want to find is maybe the mounds that houses were built on, the kind of garbage that people left around behind them. And again, this can be really challenging. But this is another great leap forward in technology that we can take advantage of as archaeologists, and that is using LiDAR, which is a laser scanning technology, or an airborne laser scanning technology. And essentially what you can do is strap a LiDAR machine to an airplane or a helicopter, and you fly it over the area that you're surveying. And it's shooting out, as you can see in this animation here, hundreds of thousands of laser points a second, and kind of measuring the rate of return and recording the return of these laser points to accurately map the landscape. So this method can help us see through the forest canopy and hit the ground surface, because there are so many laser points that they can go through the gaps in the tree leaves. So you can map the landscape, you can map the trees, you're mapping everything, roofs of houses, roads, all of that stuff. But when you're in a forested area, you can have so many lasers that they go through the gaps in the tree leaves and hit the ground surface as well too. I am not a LiDAR specialist, but plenty of people are, and they can identify a tree signature in the LiDAR data, and then you can peel that off and have your ground surface underneath. And then that's how you can see through this forest canopy to the ground underneath. So returning to our temple of Angkor Wat here, you can see the temple in the center, this forested area immediately around the temple, and then a moat, and then an even more forested area surrounding the moat as well too. Now, when you're walking around in the forest, you can tell that it's not totally flat ground surface. You can see that there's little mounds there, but it's so densely forested that it is really difficult to get a clear understanding of that landscape. But with LiDAR, we can peel off this tree layer, and then we can see this really beautiful and extremely well-planned landscape that was underneath and hidden from us, essentially, until we were able to use this LiDAR data. So what you can see now in this image is the temple in the center, and then surrounding it, this incredibly well-organized waffle pattern of higher elevation areas or mounds, and then lower elevation areas or ponds. They're laid out very beautifully in a north, south, east, west grid system. You can even see some kind of traces of little paths or streets that might have gone through, connecting these different little kind of areas or neighborhoods around the temple. And then what you can see is also on the other side of the moat to the east is a continuation of this. So even on the other side of the moat is another enclosed area with mounds, this kind of waffle pattern of mounds and ponds. And so when my colleagues and I saw this data, got this LiDAR data about Angkor Wat, it was really amazing, because it just shows you, when they built the temple, they weren't just building the temple, they were transforming this entire landscape. And this was planned from the beginning, right? So they planned out this whole landscape, they planned how they were gonna put these nice grid system in with the mounds and the ponds, the streets, and they were gonna have the moat and then area outside of the moat as well too. Then we have the area to the south with those kind of funny square spirals, which our working hypothesis is that might have been some kind of garden space, also in affiliation with the construction of the temple. So this was really exciting for us because now, as an archaeologist, we can go in and do much more targeted excavations on these mounds and understand how they fit into this broader landscape. So that's been the focus of work of a project that I've been a part of called the Greater Angkor Project, which was a collaboration between the University of Sydney, the École Française, the French School of the Far East that's been conducting research in Angkor for over 100 years, and the Apsara National Authority, which is the Cambodian government authority that oversees the Angkor Archaeological Park. So this project worked from 2010 to 2015, and one of our main goals was to look at the habitation areas around these temples in the downtown Angkor area. And so one of the places we worked at, which I'll tell you about today, is at Angkor Wat, where we had 3 seasons of field work. So what we were doing at Angkor Wat was essentially testing this model. So this is a beautiful CGI reconstruction. It's a hypothesis, essentially, of what this landscape around Angkor Wat might have looked like. This was done by my colleagues at Monash University. They've been doing really amazing work doing CGI reconstructions of Angkor. This image, I mean, it looks very suburban, right? Like this looks almost like you would fly over it on an airplane and you could put it like in Midwestern Illinois or something, right? A house, a little backyard pool, that kind of thing. So this is, again, it's a hypothesis. It's an idea that we had that if all of these mounds were occupation mounds, and each mound had one house on it, and then they had their little pond next to it. So this was an idea, but we really needed to do archaeology to test it further. And so what we were doing was sampling a variety of these mounds, putting in small test excavations. Uh-oh, sounds like my... All right, is that still working? Okay. We were putting in these small test excavations on a bunch of different mounds. So here is an overhead view of Angkor Wat again, kind of blurred out the temple so you don't get distracted by the temple. And you're just looking at our little boxes here of where we put in trenches. We were sticking on the eastern part of the temple enclosure because the western part is where you enter as a tourist, and that landscape has been much more heavily disturbed. There's little shops and stands with selling souvenirs and a nice can of cold Coca-Cola. Bathrooms, there's a couple monastery or pagodas that are there as well too. So the eastern part of the enclosure is much less disturbed, so we focused our excavations there and also on the area across the moat. And we put in a bunch of trenches. And what we found when we were putting our excavations in is that in pretty much every mound we were finding ceramics, plant remains, and other kinds of artifacts that we would expect to be from people living on top of the mounds. And so we felt like we were at least getting a pretty good idea that most of these mounds, and at least this part of the enclosure, were places where people were living. But we were just doing these small excavations, and we wanted to have a better understanding of what a single mound looked like. Could we find a house or part of a house? Could we get a better idea of the kinds of activities that were taking place on a single mound? And so in 2015, I led an excavation where we went back to one of these mounds that we had looked at in 2013, and we did a much more extensive excavation on that mound. Now I'm going to zoom in and show you a closer-up view of what that mound surface looked like. So the green and yellow areas are elevated, and then the dark blue is the blue color are the ponds or the depressions next to these mounds. And all those little black boxes are where we put in excavation trenches. One aspect of doing archaeological research in the Angkor National Park is to be very careful about the kind of archaeology that we do. So we don't want to dig huge giant holes and disrupt a lot of the archaeological record. This is also a forested landscape, as I mentioned earlier, so we need to move around trees and try and avoid large trees and the root systems. There's also quite a few termite mounds. We need to avoid those as well, too. So we have to work amongst these kind of different obstacles. And so our strategy was to put in a bunch of different small trenches across the mound and then expand them out as we were finding features. What we were finding when we were excavating is that most of the features on this mound were on the eastern part of it. So there weren't doesn't seem like there was a lot of activity in the center and the western part of the mound, but the eastern part of the mound seems to be where all the action is. And this picture is showing you an overhead view of the part of the cluster of those trenches, showing you some of our features. So unfortunately, post holes, so the posts that might have been holding up part of a house, do not photograph well. And so I've outlined where they were here on this slide. So we weren't able to excavate enough of an area to really get a footprint or a full plan of a house. but we were finding post holes that we think were associated with some kind of household architecture. And then, as you can see, the major thing we were finding were all these flat-lying stones, and these are mostly sandstone pieces. And we think that they were being recycled from the construction of the temple, and people were bringing them to their mounds and putting them down as kind of like a flat surface, like a floor, either underneath or around their house. And then we have an area that's a possible hearth, which I will talk about in just a second, too. Part of the reason why we think those sandstone pieces are coming from the construction of the temple is because we find pieces like these that are decorated and seem like they got broken while they were getting decorated and then cast aside. So we think there probably was just like a pile of leftover sandstone from while people were constructing the temple, and then the people who were living in this area must have gone and collected it and then recycled it and repurposed it in their house. Zooming in onto that hearth area that I showed you, we found this nice little circle of stones here, and to me this looked a lot like the depictions that Jodak Wan talked about and that we can see on the walls of the Bayon, of having a little hearth with stones, and then you would have your charcoal, your fire, and then your cooking pot on top of it. And in fact, we did find quite a few broken ceramics. We think cooking ceramics around this, and some charred possible food remains as well, too. And so this would correspond with our ideas about how people might have had a cooking area kind of slightly apart from the rest of their house. This was really exciting for us. Now, you might be wondering what people are eating, and unfortunately, the soil preservation conditions in Angkor are quite acidic, and so they don't preserve bone well. That means that we really have not found any faunal remains in any of our excavations, so we don't have any animal remains to tell you what kind of meat people are eating, at least. But we know, like from the Bayon, that plenty of people they're eating lots of meat, and Jodak Wan talks a little bit about it too. So we know that they're cooking probably chicken and beef and pork and fish especially, and we can see these depicted on the walls of the Bayon too. But unfortunately, we don't have any direct evidence in our excavations. We do find plant remains, however, and my colleague Christina Castillo, University College London, has done a lot of work looking at plant remains from all of our excavations and giving us a bit more of an idea about the kind of plants people are eating. Unsurprisingly, we find a lot of rice. What's interesting, however, is that when Christina looks at our plant remains, she doesn't just look at the food or the plant remains itself, but she also looks at weeds or weedy plants that are also part of the collection. And what she can see is that there are weedy plants that are associated with rice grown in more dryland environments, and weedy plants that are associated with rice that's grown in more wet environments. So the fact that she's finding both of those together suggests that people are not growing rice in Angkor Wat, and they're not growing rice next to their house, but it's coming in probably from this massive agricultural area surrounding downtown Angkor. They're bringing it into the city, and then the people here are probably buying and then processing rice and cooking it in their house rather than growing it themselves, because it's coming from so many different environments. Another major plant that we find in our excavations are mung bean that people would have also been eating. However, rice and mung bean are also mentioned in inscriptions as plants that are donated to temples and used in temple rituals as well too. So it's possible some of this was here for a ritual purpose, but also we know people are eating these as well. She then was finding a wide variety of these other plants too. And what's really interesting is she suspects that a lot of these were being grown probably in household gardens near or as part of this mound. So something like scarlet banana and crepe ginger, these can be more ornamental plants, but they do have other uses as well. So especially the leaves of scarlet banana can be used as like a wrapper, as a utensil, and Jodak Wan did talk about poor people using these kinds of organic materials as part of their daily lives. Crepe ginger can be ornamental as well too, but you can also use parts of that plant for medicinal purposes. Long pepper and black pepper also have medicinal uses, but are great seasoning, and so we can see these being used probably for cooking. And then we have tree spinach is another vegetable people might have been cooking and eating, and citrus and drinkanto melon is different kinds of fruits that people might have been growing and eating as part of their diets as well too. So this is giving us more of an idea about what people are eating and perhaps what people are growing on these house mounds. And then, interestingly, another plant remain we find that people are not eating, but using is cotton. And so we find a lot of cotton seed fragments in our excavations, both here and at another temple site in Angkor. And so what this suggests is that people are processing cotton on these mounds, and that they are probably processing cotton as part of a textile production process. So we know that cotton and cotton fabric would have been important for people's everyday kind of clothing and uses, but there's also a lot of inscriptional evidence talking about the importance of textiles, even in the use of the temple. You can see here, there's a sculpture that's at Angkor Wat that has lots of textiles on it, and so it's possible that some of these textiles might have also been used in the temple and as part of temple rituals, in addition to perhaps everyday use as well. So this gives you a bit of an idea about the activities that are taking place on the mound. Another question is, when is this all taking place, and when are people living here? And we've been learning about this from our excavations, from the radiocarbon dates, and also from the ceramics that we find in our excavations as well too. And what we're finding is that there were 3 layers, and our first layer seems to be associated with the construction of this entire Angkor Wat landscape. This huge area that was well planned, that has the mounds and the ponds and probably the area where the temple was going to be, the moat, all of this. This all seems to have been, we think, constructed around the same time in the 11th century. This is interesting because we associate Angkor Wat Temple's construction with King Suryavarman II in the early 12th century, but this does suggest that actually the landscape was being planned before this king came to power, and that this was probably a longer process than we had imagined as well too. When Angkor Wat Temple was being constructed and was in its prime use periods in the 11th to 12th centuries, this is when we have this layer 2, where we have a lot of evidence for habitation, where we find those sandstone pieces, where we have the hearth and ceramics and plant remains. And we find these Khmer ceramics, which you can see, again, beautiful examples of in the exhibit, as well as some Chinese tradeware ceramics too that are coming in. And so this gives us an idea that people are living pretty intensively, we think, on top of the mounds during this period. There's then a bit of a shift, and our top layer we associate with the post-Angkor period, and a time period when the temple would have shifted from being dedicated to the god Vishnu to becoming a Buddhist temple. And so we think that this was in the late 14th, early 15th century through about the 17th or 18th centuries. We have this evidence from radiocarbon dates and also from a variety of the regional tradewares that we're finding associated with those time periods. This top layer doesn't seem like it's the same level of kind of year-round intensive habitation during the Angkorian period. Instead, this seems a bit less permanent, a bit thinner. And so one idea is that maybe this is associated with people coming as pilgrims to Angkor Wat and maybe just spending a little bit of time living on top of the mounds or hanging out on top of the mounds instead of living there year-round as with before. A little bit more about the ceramics. I'm just going to highlight a couple really interesting pieces we found that I think give us, again, a little bit more information about the people who are living on this house mound. So this is a piece that we found. It's a Khmer or Angkorian brown glazed stoneware, very high fired pot. It's a zoomorphic jar. It's in the shape of an animal, and this is the tail end, we think, of an elephant pot. And when we find these zoomorphic pots in the archaeological record, we believe that they're often used as part of a betel nut chewing set. So you can chew betel nut, and it's a nice stimulant, kind of like a strong cup of coffee or smoking a cigarette. And there's a variety of kind of little bits and pieces that you need. You need a betel nut, you need lime paste, and you have a little leaf that you combine it all together, and then you stick it in your mouth and you chew it. And so we often associate these kinds of pots with holding the lime paste that's part of betel nut chewing. We also found this really, I think, adorable Chinese tradeware ceramic that's in the shape of a chicken, and you can see that it has a little hole where its eye is. And this is a unique piece of Chinese tradeware. What it appears to be is a water dropper. In China, a part of a Chinese scholar's writing kit would include an ink, and you would grind your ink on an inkstone, and then you would use a water dropper to drop a few drops of water, and then you might mix that all together, and then use your brush to pick up the ink and then write with it. We haven't found any other parts of a writing kit anywhere in Angkor that I'm aware of, and there's very few of these water droppers that we found. So it's not clear that people had this in their house because they were writing, but it is interesting that they had it at all. If it wasn't used for writing, I'm not sure what else they were using it, or if they just thought it was cute, like I do, and they had it in their house because they thought it was cute. But it's interesting for us because Chinese trade wares are not uncommon in Angkor, but they are not evenly distributed, and most of them are found in elite spaces like the Royal Palace. Very small numbers are found in other places. So it wasn't that regular people didn't have access to them, but they didn't have very much access to them. A lot of the ones that we do find are little covered boxes, so to have a piece like this seems very special. And to me, what it says is that maybe these weren't the poorest members of society. They were not the richest, so according to Zhou Daquan, we would have expected to find ceramic roof tiles and probably much larger posts to hold up a big heavy roof. Maybe metal objects where people were eating off of. We don't find that here, but we are probably not finding the poorest members of society either. Maybe something more like middle-class people. So to bring all this together, what we can see, we think, is that the activities that we're finding seem to indicate there was just one house per mound. Like I showed you earlier, really was concentrated just on one part of the mound. If there were multiple houses, we would have just expected more post holes, more garbage, essentially. But we don't find that, so we think there's probably just one house per mound. And what we can tell from the archaeology is that they're cooking, they're eating, they probably have household gardens. They seem to be processing cotton. And they're not growing rice, but they might have these household gardens as that they're tending as well too. As far as who are these people, this is still a big question. I mean, we strongly suggest and expect that they're probably the people who worked in the temple, just because we know that the temple required a lot of people to keep it running, and it makes sense that the people who live next to the temple probably work there too. But in order for us to confirm that, we'd really need them to leave behind more about their occupations in the archaeological record, and they haven't done that yet. So we still have a question mark about who these people are, but I still think we are learning more and more about the daily lives of people, at least in downtown Angkor, from this work. Now I'm going to shift outside of downtown Angkor to a small provincial village. You can see on this map here, I have the red outline that's showing the extent of the Angkor Empire. So we're not going very far outside of Angkor in the grand scheme of things, but we are going pretty far away from the downtown capital area, across the Tonle Sap Lake, which is right next to Angkor, into an opposite province called Battambang Province, and we're focusing on this little temple and the village surrounding it called Prasat Basait. We shifted our research to Battambang for a few reasons, and so here you can see the provincial map of Cambodia. Siem Reap is where Angkor is located, and then right across from Siem Reap and the lake is Battambang Province. Part of the reason why we selected this area is because Battambang today, as it was in the past, is a major rice-producing region. We can imagine that Angkor would probably always be wanting rice to support a large population, especially during the height of their city with 700 to 900,000 people. It's accessible via water routes to Angkor, so it's far away, but it's not that far away or that difficult to access. We also have evidence that people were living here before the Angkorian Empire in the pre-Angkor period, which is largely dated to the 6th through 8th centuries CE. We have inscriptions from this time period in this region, and they do describe local elites. So it does seem like there were people here, and even powerful people who were living here. They were Khmer speakers because the inscriptions are in Khmer. So they don't seem that culturally different from the people who are living in the Angkor area, and in fact, we do see already connections between them in some of our archaeological work. But they weren't part of that downtown Angkor. They were set apart from it. And we're really interested in what happens when this place that was seemingly independent before Angkor becomes part of the empire. There are 3 Angkorian temples in this area. So in just a second, I'm going to animate this map. You can see where we are in Angkor, and then as the map zooms in, you'll see the capital of Battambang Province, which is called Battambang Town, and then 3 Angkorian temples north, east, and south of Battambang, and we're working at Prasat Basait, which is the easternmost temple. So we'll be zooming in to Prasat Basait here, but you can see the location of these 2 other temples, Prasat Banon, Prasat Wat Phnom, and then we have Prasapa site. And from Google Earth, you can hopefully see this is a modern village. There's people living here. The actual temple is a bit obscured by the trees, so that's where that little red marker is. But just next to it is a modern Buddhist pagoda and the different pagoda buildings, so that's what you can see more clearly. This is a kind of drawing that was done by some French visitors who came to this area in 1911. And they actually documented that the temple was part of kind of a fairly large, for its size, enclosure area with a moat, multiple different buildings. There's like a central temple building, some gopuras or gateways and little towers. If you zoom in a little bit more, you can see that more clearly. The central tower is still standing, and a couple of the other ones are still kind of there. Overall, a lot of this temple has collapsed, so it's not in the best condition, but it was recently reconstructed by the Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts. So the central tower itself is quite beautiful. This is what it looks like here. So this was built by the King Suryavarman I. So before Angkor Wat was built, King Suryavarman I built this temple in the early 11th century. And you can see it's quite pretty. And it's also a very popular place to get your wedding or your pre-wedding photographs taken. And so I feel like I'm very much up on what are the latest fashions in Cambodian wedding dresses now, because whenever we're doing field work there's a variety of different people getting their photographs taken. There's lots of costume changes. It's really entertaining and actually quite lovely to see that a lot of Cambodian people come to this place for that purpose. We also have one other part of the landscape that we can still access is this little laterite-lined pond, which still holds water. It's been cleaned up since I took this initial picture, so now it's a little bit more pretty, but you can see the little laterite steps and then the pond inside of it as well, too. So we started working here in 2018, and as I said, we had this big question about, all right, we kind of are getting an understanding about what life is like in downtown Angkor. What is life like in the provinces? Can we see change over time? We had an indication that people were living here well before the temple was constructed. So what was life like before the temple was constructed? Were people connected to Angkor then, or did that increase once the temple was constructed and then maybe suddenly there were new tax and tribute demands on this community once King Suryavarman I came in and built his temple? So these are questions, ongoing questions that are part of our work. As I mentioned earlier, we also prioritize a lot of research and training and collaboration with our project. And so we incorporate either students from the Royal University of Fine Arts, archaeology students, or recent graduates. So this photograph is of 3 recent graduates that we had on our project last year joining us as interns. And so they got experience with excavation. They got some ceramic training to identify different kinds of ceramics. And then they also worked with Cristina Castillo, our paleobotanist, to learn about methods of flotation and to find our macrobotanical or plant remains as well, too. So they were a really important part of our project, and we're continuing this. I work with Miriam Stark, so we're continuing her initial research and collaboration and training that was part of her projects from the 1990s. Okay. Here we are again. You can see, again, Prasapa site, the village around it. This large rectangle is a water tank, and we think it probably was built in the Angkorian period, but we're not sure, and that's a question we're hoping to address this summer, is try and get more information about this water storage tank. And most of our work so far has been in the area south of the temple, so this is going to fade into a drawing of where our excavation units are. So we do work in a modern village, and part of doing research here is working with the community members. And so when we first came in 2018, we walked around with some members of the community who had lived there a while, and they kind of knew. We asked them, do you ever find ceramics? And they were like, oh, we find ceramics all the time. And they walked us around, and they showed us all these places, and it's true, and you just walk around, it's like leaves on the ground. There's just tons of ceramics. So it was very clear from the very beginning that this was on top of an archaeological site. And fortunately, the people in this village have been really supportive of our work. And so we identified a few places that seemed like they would be good places to do some excavations. We asked for permission from the landowners. Overwhelmingly, people have been really supportive of us, and so we usually get permission to do some small excavations and kind of dig in their backyards and disrupt their lives for a few weeks. And we've been able to go a few places around this landscape. So we're trying to excavate in areas that are a little bit closer to the temple, a little bit farther away and seeing if there's any difference or diversity in the kinds of artifacts we're finding depending on like where people are living in this little village. And so this work is very much ongoing, so I'll present what we know about so far, but we're still very much at the beginning stages of this work. So first of all, how long have people lived here? And you can see our beautiful excavation trench there. So as I mentioned, when we were walking around and looking at ceramics, it became clear just by looking at the surface ceramics that people had lived here in the pre-Angkorian period, because we were finding ceramics that dated from that period. We just didn't realize how deep the stratigraphy was. So we dug almost 3 meters below the surface. We had to stop here because we hit water. And it extended at another 20 or 30 centimeters below the water table. What we're finding from our radiocarbon dates is that some of the earliest habitation here was in the late Iron Age and very early pre-Angkor period, so the 5th to 6th centuries, and that's where they're digging here at the bottom. Then we move into the late pre-Angkor and the early Angkorian period. Haven't been able to get good dates for that chunk in the middle, but at the top we have our Angkorian layers as well too. So we know people have been living here a really long time, and again, that's part of the interest of excavating at this site, because this temple was established here for hundreds of years, or this village was established here hundreds of years before this temple. And so what happens when the king comes in and builds a temple in your village? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it complicated? You know, those are the things we're trying to address. So in our excavations, we've also been able to get more of an idea about the kinds of daily activities that are taking place in this village. The soil preservation conditions here are a little better than in Angkor, so we actually have a much richer archaeological record. Also, thankfully for me, people here are, there's a lot more garbage, I guess. People in Angkor Wat were just annoyingly clean, and one of the hypotheses is that probably people like knew they were living in a sacred temple space, and they probably like packed up their garbage and maybe dumped it in the moat outside or something, but they're not leaving it around their houses. But people here are, and that's great. So we're getting a little bit more of an idea about like what are people doing. We are getting evidence for fishing and hunting. So honestly, the fish hook is one of the most exciting things we've found, because those are so small and so fragile. And it's just so amazing to me that we even found this in our excavations. But we're also finding fishing net weights. And then we find these little slingshot pellets, which are actually not uncommon in the archaeological record. And the reason why we know they're slingshot pellets is because people make and use them today. So that bottom picture is when I was just walking around the village. I think I was like going to get some ice or something from one of the little shops. And I walked by someone's yard, and they had just made a bunch of these and were just leaving them out to dry in the sun. And kids use them a lot just to play around with each other, but you can also use them to hunt small birds or like small mammals, especially rats, that kind of thing. So we find those in the archaeological record too. So fishing and hunting. At Angkor Wat, I told you, we have evidence for textile production and cotton processing. However, we weren't finding any spindle whorls there, which would be a part of the spinning process of processing cotton and using it for textiles. But we find a lot of spindle whorls here, and so much so that it seems like this was probably a really important craft activity for people in this village. We find some really interesting different shapes, so that might mean that they're spinning different kinds of fibers. You can see like this one here had a beautiful design, a flower petal design on the bottom. This image here is from Central America. It's not from Cambodia, but it shows you someone using a spindle whorl while they're spinning. So we think people would be using them similarly in the Angkorian and pre-Angkorian periods. We're also, of course, people are cooking, so we're finding some interesting little stove features in places where we think people might have been cooking, as well as some other kinds of stove features that we think might have been for some small-scale metallurgy. We don't find a lot of metal remains or slag, but we are finding crucibles, and we're finding these kind of little furnace areas in our excavations, so it does seem like there is some kind of small-scale metal production here. We're not sure what kind of metal. One idea is it might be bronze. So hoping to investigate that a little bit more. Then we do get animal bones here, which is super exciting. So we have different kinds of mammal bones, lots of fish bones, turtle, shell as well. This past field season, we actually found some deer antler And then while we were doing survey, unfortunately this wasn't from one of our excavations, but while we were doing survey around the village, we found this giant bone, which my colleague told me is the proximal femur head of a juvenile elephant. So we have a very diverse ecological environment in the area where people are living here now. My colleague Cristina Castillo has just started looking at our plant remains, and when she was in the field with us, she said, "I can tell you right away you have rice and cotton." And so rice, again, not surprising, but cotton goes along with all of our spindle whorl evidence, so that is really exciting for us too. Her work is ongoing, so hopefully we're going to be getting more about the kinds of plants people are growing and eating as well. Lastly, we found a bunch of other cool artifacts. I don't know how to classify them, so I just have a slide that says cool artifacts. So we have this cow figurine, which I just love. I think it's adorable. I don't know what it was for, but it's really cool. We found this stone mold, which we think might have been part of like embossing some kind of like flat metal sheet. We're not sure. We think with a rat design on it. And then we found this cover or lid to a small box that might have been made out of bone or ivory and has a similar kind of like flower petal design on it as well. So it's really exciting that we're getting so many like wonderful, diverse artifacts that are telling us about different parts of life in this area. Of course, as I mentioned, we are working in a village, so we're not just looking at dead people and their garbage or looking at dead people's garbage, but we're trying to work with the local community as much as possible. And so, as I mentioned, when we first start working there, we always ask for permission when we talk to people about excavating in places and making sure we have landowner permission. And then before every excavation field season, we also have a blessing ceremony that's led by a local non-monk kind of religious specialist, an acha. And then we have some monks as well who come and lead a blessing. So we did our one last year in front of the Basite temple. And so that gets us hopefully started with permission from local people and from local spirits. And then, of course, there's a lot of curiosity about the work that we're doing too. So while we're doing research, plenty of people come visit us like during the day and just see what we're working on. We hire local people to work on our project. And so now we've had several people who've worked on our project for 3 years. And honestly, they're some of the best ambassadors for our project. They're the ones who are telling their friends who stop by what we're doing. Everyone always asks, "Are you looking for gold?" And no, we're not looking for gold. We haven't found gold. But they're always like, but they get really excited about these ceramics. And so they've been really wonderful. A lot of our field crew have been really wonderful for telling other people in the village about what we're doing. But we do have more formal community outreach events. So we have a dissemination of excavation results event where we had people from actually the local University of Battambang, from the local high school, and from the village itself, who came, and we had a formal tour of our excavation trenches where our Cambodian archaeologists led the tours and led the explanations of the excavations. We had little stations showing the different kinds of artifacts that we were finding, and again, the Cambodian archaeologists were leading the outreach for this as well too. So what was interesting is that there were students from the University of Battambang who were from Battambang and had never visited that temple. And so we realized actually that the stakeholders are not just the people in the village, but people who live nearby and in Battambang town and the province as well, who have an interest in their cultural heritage from this site too. We also have been partnering with a comic book artist named Lida E, and he's been helping us produce this comic book. You can see some of his sketches here. When you work in Angkor, people in Siem Reap, there's some like second and third generation Cambodian archaeologists there who've been working since their parents and grandparents worked with French archaeologists going back into the early 1900s. There's a much greater awareness of what archaeology is, what archaeologists do, and the importance of cultural heritage in Siem Reap because it's just been so much a part of people's livelihoods. In Battambang, however, I showed you there's only 3 major Angkorian temples. Archaeology has not really been practiced extensively in this area, and so a lot of people just don't even understand what archaeology is as a field of research. And so we realized right away that one of the things we wanted to do was help people understand not only what our results are and what we're finding, but contextualizing like what are we doing in the first place? Why is archaeology important? How do you use archaeology to study the past? And so Lida has been helping us with this comic book. We have a nice narrative story about how there's a little girl whose father works as an archaeologist on our project, and she comes to visit the site, and one of the Cambodian archaeologists tells her about what we're finding and what we're doing, and then she goes to sleep and dreams that she's in the Angkorian period and seeing all of it. So it's a really wonderful story. We're hoping to have the comic book ready next year for dissemination to the village and to the local schools as well. And it's been great having him be a part of it too, because he's not an archaeologist, and he's always the one who's like, oh, what you're talking about is too boring. No one's interested in that. What they really want to know is like this, this, and this. So he's really been great for helping us create a narrative that's really exciting, I think, and will be interesting to people. So what we've learned so far, as I mentioned, we're really at the beginning stages, so I still have a lot of questions and not a lot of answers yet. But what we can see is that at this provincial village, there's this really long history of habitation. And unlike at Angkor Wat, it doesn't seem like the landscape was completely kind of transformed from scratch. That temple was constructed in the middle of a village of people who were already living there. And so what we're hoping is to try and understand the impact that had on people, and at the same time just get a better idea about their daily lives. And we're already seeing that we'll be able to have a much richer understanding of their different kind of household activities, the environment, the ecology of the area, what they're hunting and gathering and growing to eat, the craft production, so metallurgy and textiles, we think, and then from there trying to understand the relationship between this site and the capital too. So of course this work is ongoing, and I hope that in the next few years we'll be able to start answering some of the questions that we have. Just to conclude, I want to bring this back to the idea about the people of Angkor. So I hope this has convinced you, if you weren't convinced already, how important archaeology is for understanding the daily lives of non-elite people, and with this, getting a more holistic understanding of the Angkorian past. It's not just kings and rulers and temples. There were a lot of everyday people there who were just living their lives, and to me, that's still valuable and important information. We can also see that Cambodia's archaeological heritage does extend beyond the temples. It's not just temples, like I said, but it does include this whole landscape of the mounds and the places where people are living surrounding those temples too. And lastly, the modern day people of Cambodia are the reason why we're able to do this kind of research, having our colleagues and collaborators and even the everyday people of Basait Village who come and ask us questions. They really push us to make sure that the work we're doing is interesting and relevant to modern Cambodian people as well too, and not just archaeologists coming in from outside, and academic archaeologists also. So the modern people of Cambodia have been really helpful, I think, for making our work so much more rich and important as well too. So with that, I will wrap up, and I believe we have some time for questions, but if we don't get to any questions or you want to reach out, please feel free to email me as well. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alison. Wow, that was rude. So we have time for questions. We have Jamie on that side, and we've got Dane on this side. We have a couple of handheld mics. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll find you, and we'll kind of popcorn back and forth. So let's start over on that side, Jamie.
All right, I have one over here.
How much are there parallels with modern life in Basait Village to the lives of the people in the past? Is it still agricultural? Are they practicing some of the same activities as centuries past?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's definitely still an agricultural village, so people are rice farming. And like I showed you, they're still using those little clay pellets and slingshots to hunt. And people are fishing as well too. There's a little river that runs near the site, and so people are also fishing as well. That being said, a lot of life has been transformed, and so it's not exactly a one-to-one correlation, but you can see some kind of continuity between agricultural and agrarian life from the Angkorian period through to today as well too.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned that there's no burial mounds or things like that. That leads me to wonder, are they maybe doing some form of cremation or that kind of thing? Is there any evidence that you've found of something like that?
Yes, as I fix my mic here. Yes, so we do find that kind of evidence. Well, backing up. Before the Angkorian period, we do have burials, and so it seems like there was a pre-Hindu Buddhist tradition of burying people in the ground, and so we do find burials from that period. And there are some, I probably could count on one hand the number of burials dating to the Angkorian period, so it wasn't completely abandoned. But yes, the idea is that once people largely adopted Hindu Buddhist practices, that there was a shift to cremation. We have not found very many of those cremation grounds, however. I know of a few post-Angkorian cremation sites where they have found cremation burials near Buddhist pagodas. And there was, before the war, before the Khmer Rouge period, there was what was thought to be an elite or royal cremation ground, burial ground that was found within Angkor. And unfortunately, during the war, all of the even excavation paperwork, the records, and all of the remains from that were lost. And so there were some photographs, and someone wrote an article kind of trying to reconstruct from memory what they had remembered from that excavation beforehand, but we don't find them very often either. But yes, we do think that people were cremating, mostly cremating the dead. Good question.
And I have one over here.
The demise of the empire.
I mean, I could talk for another hour about that. So there's probably, the current thinking is that there were probably a variety of factors. The old view, if you have like an old textbook about Angkor, the old view is that Angkor was sacked by the Thais in 1431, and they kind of like burnt down the city and like took all of the, like everything, like all of the artisans and all of the beautiful like sculpture and everything back to Ayutthaya, the capital in Thailand, and then Angkor was abandoned. But we know that's not true. However, there definitely were tensions between Angkor and the Ayutthaya kingdom in Thailand, and so probably there was a good reason for some of the Angkorian kings to want to like move a little bit farther away and have a bit more of a buffer zone. At the same time, there's a lot of good evidence that there was a slow climatic change that was taking place that was really disrupting the water management network at Angkor. And so when Angkor's water management network was initially constructed, it was in a very favorable climate. But towards the end of its time, there was this series of droughts, and they were modifying the water management network for droughts, and then they would get these really heavy monsoons, and it would blow out their water management network. That happened twice, actually. Drought, monsoon, drought, monsoon. And by the end of the second monsoon phase, it seems like enough people had already started leaving the city. There wasn't a lot of interest in maintaining those water management networks. And it does seem like there was this movement of people out of the capital. So those would be push factors. A pull factor is that the area where Phnom Penh is today is much better suited for international trade. And Cambodia in the past, much like people today, wanted to engage in trade with China. And so some of my other colleagues think that a pull factor would have been to relocate the capital kind of farther away from the Ayutthayan court, farther away from this failing water management network, and in this area where you could also take advantage of maritime trade. So it probably was a variety of factors. What we see, though, is that the demise did not happen in a single event. There's no evidence that Angkor was sacked and burned. What it seems like is a slow depopulation over time.
Since Angkor was such a large civilization at the time, is it possible that the area around Baset was perhaps a clothing manufacturing area for the wider Angkor civilization, and the trade was in the direction of the main Angkor Wat area?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's too early for us to tell exactly how extensive the textile production was there. But we do know, cloth is much easier to transport than rice. And so some of my colleagues have made a good point that probably a lot of tribute wasn't necessarily being sent directly as rice to the capital. It was being converted into other goods like maybe metals and cloth, and then that would be getting sent as tribute to the capital and then used in market exchange as well too. So it is entirely possible. I wouldn't rule out that other places were also producing a lot of textiles, but it does seem like they're doing a lot of textile work here just based on the spindle whorls. So I wouldn't be surprised that it was at least some kind of major part of their economy also.
Did they fight wars?
Sorry, did they
fight wars? Fight wars?
Oh, yes, for sure. I didn't show any of these images, but there's lots of depictions on the temples of the kings defeating their enemies. One major rival was the Cham kingdoms that were located in what is now central Vietnam. And so they depict land battles and they depict like naval battles as well too. So they definitely were. We do find some weaponry, and there's lots of depictions and there are discussions about putting down rebellions and that kind of thing in the inscriptions as well too. So, yeah, if you ever have a chance to see this, there has been there's like a musical group that is reconstructing an Angkorian musical procession that would have played while the army was essentially coming to fight you. And so we see depictions on the bas-reliefs of these temples of the different kinds of musical instruments, and that they would have these these musicians traveling with the army. And it is one of the most amazing experiences. They have these conch shell horns, and I don't know, I would put down my weapons immediately if I was just presented with like these guys on elephants and this massive army and this with a soundtrack. I mean, it's really amazing. So if you ever, sometimes in Siem Reap they do shows with the Angkorian orchestra, and that's quite spectacular. So.
I wonder if you have a theory about why everyone has a pool in their
Oh.
yard.
That's a good question. So we actually had a geoarchaeologist come work on our project because we were wondering, like, were these holding water all year round, or were they like freshwater fish ponds? What was going on there? And he said that it seemed like they were seasonally wet, and so probably what they were used for was to kind of collect water during the rainy season. And from firsthand experience, I can say that would have been really important because of the American academic calendar, I do excavation during our summer, which is the Cambodian rainy season. And so I've been working on those house mounds when it's wet and rainy, and it's great to have these kind of pools to have the water kind of accumulate in, and then you could definitely use them for whatever kind of daily living activities you might need water for. So I think that's probably what they were for, is they were just collecting rainwater.
And we have time for 2 more questions. We have one here and one on Dane's side.
Where did they find all the stone from which they made the temples?
Oh, that's a good question too. So some of the temples are made out of brick, and those would have been made out of local clay. Some of the temples are made using laterite. There's laterite stone quarries that are not far from Angkor, and then there are also sandstone was the primary stone used to make temples like Angkor Wat. And there's plenty of sandstone quarries around Angkor. And you can visit them and even see like where they cut the blocks from, and kind of some of the places where they've been chiseling and kind of stopped in the middle. There are some interesting studies that have talked about how they probably floated blocks down some of the rivers and canals to get to the temples. And they might have also used elephants, actually, too, to help move some of I believe there's been some hypotheses about using elephants as manual labor to carry some of the blocks to the temples, too.
So I'm very interested in the population numbers.
Yes.
So can you tell us, first off, what was counted, and then what you used to translate what was counted into a number of people?
Okay, I'm going to give you a very short answer, but I'll say that we've published a couple articles about this, and if anyone's interested, some of them are posted online, but if you would like copies of any of our articles, please feel free to email me, and I'm happy to share copies of our articles. So with that caveat, I'm just going to say that we were using so we actually drew on the excavations at Angkor Wat that the mounds were about 600 meters square, and that there was 1 house per mound. So we were using that as an estimate for the kind of area of a house. And then we used the LiDAR data. My colleague Sarah Clausen estimated the surface area, and then we were able to kind of pull apart this palimpsest of this map of Angkor that you see, and try and see how, like, when different parts of the city were constructed over time, count how many meters square of surface area, and then multiply that by 5 to get our population, because we were using 5 as a number for how many people were in a household, and that's based on ethnographic data about the size of a typical Cambodian house family. And so we used that, so it's definitely a hypothesis that needs further testing, but we were using that as one way of trying to estimate the population of Angkor over time. We had a slightly different method for the countryside where a lot of those mounds are not, they're really not preserved anymore. And so for that, we used some machine learning algorithms, and that's all of Sarah Clausen's work. So for that, I would direct you to our publication. But it did start with our work at Angkor Wat to try and estimate, like, what is the size of a household spatially.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Alison. I've seen this talk now twice. I'd like to see it again. So come on back. It'd be great. Hey, folks, thank you so much for coming tonight. We appreciate your support of the museum. Once again, I'd like to thank our lecture series sponsors, the R. Harold Burton Foundation, the Cultural Vision Fund, Rio Tinto Kennecott, the M. Lazy M Foundation, the D. Fiore Family Foundation, Frog Bench Farms, the Nature Conservancy, and the Wolf Clark Foundation, as well as the Salt Lake County ZapTax. Please come and see our keynote speaker in 2 weeks, April 4th at Kingsbury Hall, Ella Al-Shamahi. Thank you very much, Alison. Really wonderful talk. Please take care going home and come back and see us. Thank you.